The silence after someone you love is gone. It's not peaceful. It's deafening. That's how it felt the morning after I lost Harold, my husband of 47 years. I'd always thought the ticking of the old kitchen clock was too loud. But that day it was the only sound I could hear. No footsteps, no humming from the hallway. Just the hollow echo of a house that had once been full of life, now painfully still. I sat by the window with my coffee, which had long gone cold, watching the leaves drift across the empty driveway. For the first time in decades, I had nowhere to be, and no one waiting for me to come back. And let me tell you, that kind of loneliness doesn't knock. It just walks in and settles like fog in your bones. They say loneliness can hurt the heart. Not in the poetic sense, in the very real medical kind of way. The CDC has published studies showing that social isolation in people over 60 increases the risk of stroke, dementia, and even early death. And yet, it's not something we talk about much, is it? Because when you've raised children, buried friends, watched time move past you like a train you're no longer on, the world starts to feel less like a home and more like a waiting room. That's where I was, quietly drifting day by day, until a little soul with muddy paws and sad eyes showed up at my porch. Her name was Molly, but I'll get to her in a moment. First, let me tell you what it's like when your heart forgets how to hope. Because that's the part most people skip over when they say, just get a pet, you'll feel better. No, healing doesn't start with a wagging tail. It starts when someone, anyone, even a scruffy little creature, looks at you like you still matter. And that, my dear, is where the science begins to make sense. She didn't bark, didn't scratch the door, just sat there, looking up at me, like she already knew I needed something I didn't even know how to ask for. Molly was a stray, the neighbor later told me. No tags, no collar, just ribs showing under matted fur and a limp in her right paw. But her eyes, my God, her eyes. They were soft, amber-colored, and old, like they'd seen too much but never stopped hoping. I opened the screen door, more out of instinct than decision. She walked in slowly, respectfully, almost like she didn't want to bother me. And then, she just curled up right at Harold's old recliner. Not mine. I stared at her, and for a brief second, I swear, something inside me cracked just enough to let a little air in, like the first breath after crying too long. Later that evening, I sat on the floor next to her with a bowl of warm oatmeal and some leftover chicken. She ate like she hadn't in days. But it wasn't the food that made her stay. It was the silence between us, not the kind that crushes you, but the kind that says, you don't have to explain anything. I'm here. That night, for the first time in months, I slept through till morning. Now, I know what some folks might be thinking. It's just a dog. But here's what science has to say. When we interact with animals, especially through eye contact or gentle touch, our brains release oxytocin, the same hormone that bonds mothers to their babies. That's why when Molly looked at me with those warm, tired eyes, it didn't just feel emotional. It was biological. Oxytocin reduces stress, lowers blood pressure, and even improves heart function. Researchers from Harvard and UCLA have shown that even short-term pet interaction can lead to measurable improvements in mood and physical health in elderly adults. But let me tell you something those studies can't quite capture. That moment, sitting on the floor beside a scruffy dog, I wasn't an old widow anymore. I was a woman being seen, a woman being needed, again. And in a world that often forgets the elderly, being needed. That's the most powerful medicine of all. The funny thing is, I used to eat standing at the counter. Toast, instant soup, maybe half a banana. When you live alone, you stop setting the table. You stop lighting candles. You stop thinking meals are worth slowing down for. But then came Molly. The first morning she stayed, she followed me to the kitchen, tail thumping like a tiny drumbeat of hope. I hadn't cooked in weeks. But suddenly there I was, boiling rice, chopping leftover chicken, even peeling carrots. One for her, one for me. A strange sort of rhythm returned. The clink of spoons, the hiss of the kettle, the sound of life, small but certain. We started having breakfast together by the window. She'd sit at my feet, eyes half closed in the sun, while I talked to her about the newspaper headlines I never read out loud before. I found myself putting on a cardigan again, brushing my hair, wiping the table twice. Not because anyone was watching, but because someone was with me. And it turns out science knows this too. Studies from Johns Hopkins and the National Institute on Aging show that elderly pet owners often develop healthier daily routines. They sleep better. They move more. They even eat more regularly and nutritiously, because they're not just caring for themselves anymore. They're caring for a living being that depends on them. And when you're responsible for something, even something small and furry, gives you purpose. And purpose at my age is gold. I remember thinking one afternoon, as I sliced apples for us both, is this what healing looks like? Not therapy, not medication, just a dog and 2 bowls on the floor. Funny how the smallest lives can bring back the biggest pieces of us. You'd be surprised how much you have to say, once you have someone who listens without interrupting. I started talking to Molly. Not in a baby voice, not with silly words, just talking. About Harold. About how I missed folding his laundry. About how the silence in the grocery aisle still made my chest tighten. About the dreams I'd have where I'd hear his keys at the door, only to wake up and find my hands reaching for no one. And Molly, she never looked away. She'd tilt her head just slightly, or place her chin on my knee. And I swear, in those moments I felt more heard than in years of polite small talk with neighbors or distracted calls from the kids. There's something sacred about that kind of presence. You see, the human brain is wired for connection. And even without words, the act of being seen, being near another breathing soul, activates the same parts of the brain as verbal conversation. Neurologists at the University of Missouri found that petting a dog or cat for just 15 minutes can increase serotonin and dopamine, the very chemicals that fight depression. But beyond the chemicals and charts, there's this quiet truth. Sometimes what you need isn't someone to fix your pain. You just need someone to sit with you in it. Molly didn't give advice. She didn't quote scriptures. She just listened, with her whole being. And for a woman who had spent months feeling invisible, that meant everything. I remember once, I was crying so hard I couldn't breathe. It was Harold's birthday. I hadn't cried like that in a long time. I sat on the kitchen floor, hands shaking, chest aching. Molly came over, gently pressed her body against mine, and just stayed. No words, no movement, just warmth, just presence. That was all I needed. And maybe, just maybe, that's all most of us ever really need. Started with a leash, old faded red, found at the bottom of a drawer I hadn't opened since Harold passed. I almost put it back, but Molly was already sitting by the door, tail swaying, eyes bright, as if she knew today was the day. So I put on my shoes, the sturdy ones I hadn't worn in months, and we stepped outside together. The air was crisp, that kind of morning chill that stings just enough to make you feel alive. Molly sniffed every patch of grass like it was a love letter. I watched her, one hand in my pocket, the other gripping the leash tighter than I needed to. Not out of fear, but out of unfamiliarity. I hadn't walked this block since the funeral. First it was just me and her. A woman and her dog, pacing slowly down the sidewalk like we were relearning the rhythm of the world. But then something happened. A man across the street waved. I didn't recognize him. He pointed at Molly and said, "Rescue." He nodded. He smiled. "Best decision you ever made." The next morning we saw him again. And another woman with a golden retriever. Then a lady with 2 cats in a stroller. Yes, a stroller. Soon what started as a quiet walk turned into something more. Nod here, chuckle there, then stories, then names, then real conversations. It was Molly who brought me there. But it was the people, the community, that slowly pulled me back into the fabric of the neighborhood I thought I had disappeared from. According to a study by the British Psychological Society, over 80% of elderly pet owners report increased social interactions simply by walking their pets. Dog parks, sidewalks, even vet clinics. They become gentle bridges between isolated hearts. And that's the thing. Loneliness thrives in silence, in stillness. But connection grows in movement, in little hellos, in shared stories about stubborn puppies and chewed slippers. One morning, a man named Charles, Vietnam veteran, widower, walker of a grumpy bulldog named Rufus, handed me a small thermos of coffee and said, "It's better when we walk together." And he was right. Molly gave me back my mornings. But the world, kind and curious, gave me back my voice. It started with her skipping dinner. First I thought maybe she was just tired. We'd walked farther that day, met a new friend at the park, chased a few squirrels. But then she turned away from her favorite treat. No tail wag, no hopeful glance, just a quiet retreat to her bed in the corner of the room. I watched her through the night. Her breathing grew shallow. She wouldn't lift her head. And all at once, that familiar panic gripped me. The kind you feel when someone you love starts to slip away, and you're helpless to stop it. I sat by her side, fingers gently on her back, whispering, "Please don't leave me too." By sunrise, we were at the vet. I hadn't driven at night in years, but I didn't think. I just moved, as if love itself had taken the wheel. The waiting room was too bright, too sterile. A young couple with a kitten, a man with an old Labrador who couldn't stand, and me, knees pressed together, hands trembling, heart screaming behind a calm face I could barely hold on to. The vet came out. Her voice was kind, steady. "It's just a virus, a little dehydration. She'll need fluids and rest. But she's going to be fine." I nearly cried. Not from relief, but from realizing how deep she'd rooted herself into me. Molly wasn't just a companion. She was my second heartbeat. You see, grief doesn't make you numb. It makes you terrified. Terrified of loving again. Terrified of losing again. And yet, we love anyway. Science calls this resilience, the brain's ability to rewire itself after trauma. According to a study in Frontiers in Psychology, interacting with animals activates the brain's reward system, especially in those recovering from loss. This encourages bonding, empathy, even courage. But I didn't need a journal article to tell me that. I just needed to look at Molly, weak but breathing, eyes half open, paw resting against my palm, to know that healing isn't about never being hurt again. It's about being willing to love, even when it scares you. That night, she lay beside me, head on my arm, heartbeat steady and strong. I held her close and whispered, "Thank you for staying." And somewhere in that silence I realized, maybe we don't rescue animals. Maybe they rescue us. I never thought I'd write a letter to a dog. But one quiet afternoon, after folding the laundry, after our walk through the park, after she'd curled up at my feet like she always did, I sat at the kitchen table, pulled out a sheet of yellowing paper and began to write. "Dear Molly," I wrote. Pause. And then the words just came. "You'll never read this, I know. But there are things in my chest that I need to put somewhere. And you're the only one who's really listened." I told her everything. How I didn't know how to keep breathing after Harold died. How the world felt like an echo, and I was just waiting for the final silence. How I stopped buying flowers, stopped baking pies, stopped humming. And how, from the moment she walked through my door, I started coming back to life. You didn't judge me for crying into the sink. You didn't ask me to smile when I couldn't. You never rushed me. You just stayed. And in doing so, you taught me how to stay with myself again. I told her about the way she brought the world back to my doorstep. How neighbors who never spoke now stopped to say hello. How I'd started brushing my hair again. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to feel good. I told her how she reminded me of Harold. Not in the way she looked, but in the way she loved. Steady, quiet, constant. And I ended with this. "If you go before me, I promise I won't run from the grief. I'll sit with it, like you sat with mine. And if I go before you, well, I hope you'll rest your head on someone else's knee and remind them that love, even if it comes wrapped in fur and silence, can still save a life." I folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it behind her photo on the bookshelf. She'll never read it. But somehow, I think she already knows. Because some souls don't need words. They just need presence. And Molly, from the very start, had been a quiet miracle I never knew I needed. The experts call it pet therapy. They'll show you charts, hormone levels, MRI scans of the brain. They'll tell you that time spent with animals lowers cortisol, reduces blood pressure, increases serotonin, and triggers oxytocin, the bonding chemical. They'll say pets help with depression, anxiety, and even cognitive decline. And they're right. The science is sound. But if you ask me, a woman who once believed her heart had nothing left to give, I wouldn't call it therapy. I'd call it a miracle wrapped in fur. Because no scan, no study, no journal article can fully explain what it feels like to have a silent companion curl up beside you on the hardest days. No graph can measure the moment you laugh again after months of only remembering how to cry. They don't track the way your hand slowly forgets the tremble as it learns to pet, to hold, to care. Or how your eyes soften when someone, even a creature who cannot speak, looks at you as if you're still worthy of love. Molly didn't cure my loneliness. She simply reminded me I didn't have to carry it alone. And maybe that's the lesson here. We spend our lives searching for grand answers. Healing, happiness, peace, in pills, in places, in people. But sometimes the answer walks in quietly. Doesn't ask questions. Just stays. So if your house feels too quiet, if the nights stretch a little too long, maybe, just maybe, you don't need someone to fix it. Maybe you just need someone to share the silence with. Not all angels have wings. Some have paws. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched you, or reminded you of a furry friend who once saved you, share it. You never know who might need to hear that they're not alone today.